Hi everyone and welcome. Thank you for being here today. The Political Science and Economics Department is very excited to have Dr. Douglas Weber here from Temple University. He's an associate professor at Temple in economics and a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics. He's published on a wide variety of topics in the fields of labor and the economics of higher education. Topics include earnings inequality, expenditures in higher education, the gender pay gap, the economic returns to college major, and student loan debt. So I think you'll really like his talk, and if you have questions afterward, you can ask them then.
Thank you so much for having me. So I've really enjoyed my time so far and getting to meet all of the great faculty here. So I'm going to talk about something which is probably very familiar to everyone in the room. It's I'm going to talk about kind of the returns to college. What you can reasonably expect to get out of your education. How things like what your major is, how much debt you take out to get the degree, and graduating itself, how these all relate to how we think about these in terms of talking about the return on investment to college, because there's a lot of times people will want to boil it down to just one number. The return on investment is X percent. But it's way more complicated than that. And I'm going to hopefully communicate a lot of the nuance on that today. Before we get started, I do want to mention I'm legally blind, so I likely won't be able to see people's hands raised beyond the first couple rows. But we'll take questions at the end, but if there's something that is just really, really unclear, or feel free to shout it out, or let Lauren know. So kind of the general motivating question that I want to focus on is, how much debt should people take on to invest in college? And how do things like your college major, how do things like your own personal background, your innate ability, how much does this factor in when we're talking about does college pay off? How long until it pays off? Or an even better way to phrase that is, what is the probability that it's going to pay off? Because not everyone gets the exact same college premium, even if they, with the same major. If you took identical twins, put them in the same major, people are just through random luck are going to get different returns. And so I think it's much better to think about the returns to college in a probabilistic way. That what is the likelihood that it's going to pay off, like almost like buying a stock. That sometimes it's going to pay off. On average, it is. Sometimes it's going to pay off really, really big. Sometimes it's not. And this is not normally the way that people talk about the returns to college, but I think it one is more honest, and two is just a much more nuanced way to discuss things. So I'm also going to talk about what about the return. How close are we to maybe having too many people in college? This is a topic that is a kind of a hot political topic now. That does everybody get on average a positive return to college? Would it be more beneficial if let's say you start school, you wind up not doing too well? Is it should you take that as a signal that just it's not for me, I should cut my losses, drop out, enter the labor market? I'm going to show you some, really, really strong evidence that says no, at least on average, that is not it's not the income maximizing thing to do. And then, assuming we have time, I'm going to talk towards the end about one, some kind of trends that, well, why have college costs been increasing over time? I'm going to talk, we're at a public school here. I work at a public school. I went to public schools all my life. So, how have public schools been disproportionately affected by funding, state divestment? Kind of where's the money going? If the money is no longer in higher education, where is it going? And then I'll conclude with some kind of big picture policies about things that are being talked about now, things that what might the future of higher education policy look like. So a lot of my work recently has focused on the lifetime returns to getting a college degree. It's a complicated thing to do. You need, and I pull together quite a few data sources. And I'm certainly not the only person who looks at this. Now, in general, myself and everybody who looks at the returns to college, there's on average a big positive effect. That even once you control for the type of person who goes to college, that economists sometimes call this an ability bias, that it's not random who goes to college, that on average, every person in this room, if I take the average ability, intelligence, IQ, whatever you want to call it, that you guys are far smarter than the average person in this country. And you are, I feel very confident in saying that if I were to look all of you up 10, 15, 20 years from now, that the average earnings in this room are going to be much higher than the average earnings for people with only a high school diploma in this country. But then that begs the question, are you earning more money because you got the college degree? In other words, is it a causal effect? Because you got the college degree and that directly causes you to make more money? Or are you going to earn more in part because you were smarter to begin with? And intelligence has a premium in the labor market. And so even if I were to say, if I were to have the power to disenroll everyone from classes right now, kick all of you out and blacklist you from enrolling in any other college in the country, I would still expect that you're going to have higher earnings than the average high school grad, by virtue of the fact that you are smarter than the average person. Now, college is not, it's not an all or nothing thing, that it's not 100% causal effect and it's not 0% causal. But it's somewhere in between, and that's a hard thing to measure. I'm not going to get into the econometrics of how the way that I do that today, but know that we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies that all come to basically the same conclusion through different methodologies, that there is a very, very strong positive causal effect of returns to college. So if let's say, to put roughly some numbers to it, let's say that a college grad is going to earn over their lifetime, say 80% more than the typical high school grad. So what I'm saying is that of that 80%, maybe 55%, 60%, of that, so I don't want to use percents in a couple different ways here. So let's say, more than half that, is a causal effect, but there's, some proportion of it. So I'd say, 2/3 is a causal, 1/3 is this, ability bias. But that's going to differ across, some majors are more causal effect than others, some degrees, some institutions. This is a really complicated thing. But before getting into all that nuance, let's just look first just what the annual earnings trajectory of the median person with a college degree, the median person with only a high school diploma looks like. So before, and this is a really naive way to look at it, and you need to do a lot more than this, but you could, fundamentally what we want to do is, if we want to say, well, when is a college degree worth it? It's whenever the area between these curves over here is greater than this area over here. So you're in college, let's say you're not working, that's why I have the college at 0. But there's a lot of ways that this is not representing reality. One, here we have the implicit costs, the opportunity costs of being in college, i.e. you're not earning a high school grad's wage right now, but you're also probably paying something to be here. The explicit costs, the tuition, room and board, things that you wouldn't otherwise be paying, books, all that stuff. So we can think about lowering this below 0. We could think about extending this to different majors. That there are huge differences in earnings across majors. If we, just still doing quite a bit of aggregation, that STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, and business majors tend to be towards the top. Then we have social sciences, arts and humanities. Then here we have, those are kind of the 2-year diplomas, and then high school. Now, there's still a lot of heterogeneity that this is covering up. That say an econ major is one of the top earning majors, period. That an econ major I think makes, and you can go to my website, I'll show you later where you can find this, that the typical econ major will make about $1 million more over the course of their lifetime than, say, a management major or a marketing major. This is, now this is a lot, but econ here is still considered one of the social sciences. So econ is maybe pulling the social sciences up quite a bit. There are other social sciences which are pulling it down, one big one. And I'm not making any value judgments about different majors. These are just facts about how much they earn. For instance, psychology. One of the big issues with psychology is there are so many people with a psychology degree. So basic supply and demand, that the supply is huge. The returns tend to be a lot less. Things like, do you go to grad school, matter quite a bit. Even within STEM, a lot of people think, oh, well, we see a STEM major, that must be a ticket to higher earnings. Not all the time. For engineering, it pretty much always is. For something like, say, biology, a biology major who does not go to graduate school, so importantly, I'm ruling out medical school here. A biology major who does not go to any form of graduate school has lifetime earnings roughly equivalent to art history. So, my point is, all STEM are not created equal, all majors are not created equal, even when you break them up into these very different categories. So, I mentioned there were some corrections that this is breaking things down by major. It's important. It's useful to know what the different lifetime earnings are across different majors. But if we're talking about, does college pay off? Does it, is it worth the investment? We need to dig deeper. And here's a few of the things that I want to talk about. So, one, selection. This is something if you've taken any higher level econ classes, you've probably heard about this. All I'm saying when I say selection here is just that it's not random who goes to college. Well, what I said before, that on average, you guys are smarter than the average person in this country, and it's not random that you wound up here. that you're at a good school and you are you decided to go to college partly on the basis of some of your skills, which are going to be valued in the labor market. And so we need to control for this if we're going to say something about, well, was college worth the investment? Discounting. So if I have the choice between being given $100 today or $100 10 years from now, I would always want to have $100 today. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is just basic inflation. You can buy more. The purchasing power of $100 today is more than it will be in 10 years. But I also have the option value of doing something with that. That if I need to make a purchase, that I have a medical emergency, or I need to buy something for my family, or I want to buy a car or a house or anything, if I have the $100 today, even in a world without inflation, if I have it today, then I have the option of using it. Whereas if I don't have it for 10 years, I don't have that option, and there is a value to that. So, and because kind of definitionally, investing in college is giving up some money today for the promise of more in the future, then this is something we really want to take account of. So you may have heard the term net present value, present discounted value. All these things are just a way of accounting for the fact that money now, the same amount of money now is better than the same amount of money later. The big thing that very, very few people talk about when it comes to the college investment decision is this uncertainty about whether you're actually going to graduate from college. That nationally you're talking about 60% of first-time, full-time college freshmen are going to graduate within 6 years. So, well, we're still talking about a 4-year degree here, so we're giving extra time for them to graduate, but many of them won't. And so this is a big risk that we really want to take into account, because if there's only a 60% chance that you're going to get the degree, and let me tell you, the vast majority of the college premium is tied up in actually getting the degree. This is known as a sheepskin effect. That it is, there is some return to, taking college classes and not getting the degree, but disproportionately, it's having the diploma. And there's a ton of reasons for that, most of which I don't have, time to talk about, but one of them is just that, for employers, imagine that you have thousands of job applications to go through, and you think that let's say that you believe that college builds skills and makes you more productive, but you don't have time to read through and count up the credit hours of every single transcript of every single applicant. You use some screening devices to say, well, all right, well, generally I've had good luck with people from college in the past, so I'm just going to say the ones with a college degree, those are the ones I'm going to look at. Sure, you're probably losing out on some very qualified people who'd be great workers. But there's trade-offs to everything, and as someone who has been on a PhD hiring committee, and this year we got 562 applications of new PhDs applying for a job at Temple. So and in each of those applications we're talking about an entire dissertation, so 150 or 200 pages, bunch of letters of recommendation, you cannot possibly go through everything. So you have to make these kind of, rough rules of thumb, knowing that you're going to miss out on some people, but you're going to be right on average. So when what I have up here are the average, or sorry, I should say median, the present discounted value for the median person in, in these 4 different major categories. Now again, remember what I said before, that there's a big spread within these categories, that within social sciences, econ is several $100,000 more, psych is a lot less, but these are still averages. So when we, so this would be the raw, just, all I've done is put things in present value terms. Now, the typical college grad, not in present value terms, is going to earn somewhere between $900,000 and $1 million more over the course of a lifetime relative to just a high school grad. When we put things into present discounted value, this is what it looks like. When I account for the uncertainty of graduation, so this would be where I say, take kind of an expected value and say 60% of the time you're going to get the degree, you get the college premium. 40% of the time you're not going to get the degree and you're going to get the some college premium. So, much less. Now, why do I like putting things in terms of, why do I like accounting for this uncertainty? Because, it's, if you're talking about, say, winning the lottery. Well, it's like saying, well, look, you win the lottery, people who won the lottery made a ton of money, therefore you should play the lottery. Well, only talking about the college wage premium for people who graduated is kind of making the same fallacy. That when there is a real chance that people are not going to graduate, then only talking about the outcomes for people who do graduate is a little disingenuous in my mind. I think you need to have both. You need to have, you need to be publicizing, well, what are the returns for people who get the degree, but also, what's the expected return for the 18-year-old who doesn't know whether they're going to graduate or not. The one who, everybody thinks they're going to graduate when they start, but even people who have a very, very high subjective probability that they think they're going to graduate, and they have really good test scores, still a sizable percentage don't graduate. So my point being is there's so much uncertainty that you want to be thinking about this in somewhat like like buying a risky asset, buying a stock. It's on average the stock market is going to go up, but it's not going to go up all the time. It's not going to go up for everybody, and sometimes if you happen to buy at the wrong time, you could lose a lot of money. That possibility exists here, especially for people who do not graduate. Now, the general takeaway is college. It is a wonderful investment for the average and not the average person. That it is very, very likely to pay off, but it's not a sure thing. That it probably is the single safest investment that you could make, but still people, I do think, greatly overinflate the likelihood of success here. That just because things are heavily weighted in your favor doesn't mean it's a guarantee, and doesn't mean that it's a guarantee that that everyone's going to hit it big. It's again, it is a very, very worthwhile investment, but I think nuance is really important here. That if you promise people the moon and only a few wind up getting there, a lot of people are going to be disappointed and feel like they were, even if they're better off than the average person with a high school diploma, it's still easy to be disappointed when you've been potentially told that everyone is going to essentially win the lotto. Now, up to this point, I've mostly been talking about averages. The averages or medians that college is absolutely a good investment for the average person, but I think I'm trying to kind of get into the national conversation a little bit more of talking about things probabilistically, rather than saying, because college can be a good investment for the average person, but if that's true, that could be true in two different worlds. One world in which 60% or 55 or even only 51% of people it's worth it for. It's still worth it for the average, so it's 51% or greater. Or another world where it pays off for 98% of people. So those are two really, really different worlds. If college only pays off for 60% of people, then we're probably overselling things. If it pays off for 98%, sometimes I feel like that's kind of what we're promising. So some of the figures I'm going to show you now are going to kind of get at that and say, well, okay, well, what are the probabilities that things are going to, that a college degree is going to pay off? Well, so first, this is to kind of illustrate what the college and high school earnings distributions look like. So this right here, this is the lifetime distribution of college earnings, and this for high school. Now, what you'll notice here is that there is a reasonable amount of overlap. So roughly, say the bottom, third of college students are earning about the same as, say, the top 25% or, roughly speaking, of high school students. Now, if you're talking about the probability of, moving into upper middle or upper class, practically I don't want to say the only, it is possible, but it's almost the case that you have to be a college grad. That to make it big, to make it into the say the top the top fifth of the income distribution. It's very, very difficult to consistently do that with only a high school diploma. Some people absolutely do. Now, this is lifetime earnings here. So this is not saying that certainly you can find people who in a given year that you don't have a college degree, but you have a good year, you have a good few years, but persistently, again, lifetime. So you're much more likely to have really long periods of unemployment if you don't have the college degree. That even if you have some good years, you're more likely to have some bad years to balance them out at some other point. So this looks like, again, what I see when I look at this is the college looks like it's a really good investment, but it's not it's not a sure thing. There is still enough overlap over here that there are going to be some people who are who are disappointed. Now, putting things in slightly more probabilistic terms. So I have on the x-axis here is the annual cost that you are paying for college. So you're paying $10,000, $20,000 per year. So on the vertical axis is the probability that college is going to pay off for you. And I have two different definitions of payoff. So up here, This is the probability that you are going to earn more than someone with the median high school diploma throughout the course of your life. That, even for paying, even paying a lot of money, so even paying $20,000, $30,000, the probability is still really, really high that you are going to pass that bar. Now, this is also somewhat of a lower bar, that the labor market being what it is right now, having only a high school diploma is not a great place to be. So this other definition of success is earning in excess of $500,000 more than the median high school grad. So this would be like saying that if you get a free ride, so the only costs that you're paying are the implicit costs of not being in the labor market. But let's say that you were lucky enough to get scholarships that paid for absolutely everything, books, everything. Then there's about a 74% chance that you would make in excess of $500,000 more than the median high school grad over the course of your life. As your annual college costs go up, of course, kind of mechanically, that probability is going to go down. That, if we're talking about, in the typical kind of public school range for college costs, we're looking at maybe a 65% chance that you're going to make that much more than someone with only a high school diploma, which is a great bet. That's a bet that I'd take 10 times out of 10. But 65% is not 100. Now it is, again, very, very likely that you're going to make more than the median high school grad. But again, that's a lot of people would say, well, that's not what I signed up for when coming. So again, what I see when I look at this is college is a fantastic investment. It is, if you talked about any financial instrument, this outperforms any one of them. That any investment that you could could find in the private sector, this is better than any of them. This is a safer, more lucrative investment than you're ever going to find anywhere else. But it's still not a sure thing. So that's the kind of the big takeaway that I want people to have. I promise I'm not being rude here. I wanted to make sure I keep on time and give you guys time for questions. So one other thing I wanted to mention is that we talked about majors. There's also big differences across schools. Say when it comes to repaying your student loans. So this is a histogram of the repayment rates of student loans across different schools. Now, repayment rate, this is defined as are you making some progress on the principal balance of your loans? So this means, are you paying even just a little bit more? Are you covering your interest and maybe plus $1? So is your loan going down? Because if you're not able to make your interest payment, then your loan is getting bigger. So you'll notice that there are, and this is for 3 years after you leave school. You'll notice that there are some schools that have really, really low repayment rates. 20%, 15%, 10% of students are making progress on their loans 3 years after they leave school. There are some schools that are, this is not Rowan. Rowan is way up here. Rowan does very well, and I made sure to look that up before I came here. So if you guys didn't do well, I wouldn't have showed you the slide, but you do very well. But my point is there are a number of schools out there that are not delivering a good product for one reason or another, and it's costing students a lot of money. It's costing taxpayers a lot of money. And this is something, so I had testified before the US Senate a couple years ago about ways to reform the accountability part of the student loan system to try to make things better for students who may be unfairly targeted at some of these schools, and more broadly for taxpayers to not be able to take out so much money of ours. So I think I already talked about the takeaways. If you're interested, my website, doug-weber.com, I have a bunch of information on, say, lifetime earnings for a whole bunch of different college majors. I have some nice interactive graphics where you can, rather than just looking at the average, you can kind of click on these and compare, what is the 75th percentile of an econ major compared to the 20th percentile of some other major? Or, there's a lot of interesting comparisons that you can make. And so, go on there and all become econ majors. So this other question, is everyone, there's this discussion politically, is everybody college material? Should, should some people just, are they not cut out for college? Is it not the right decision? I like this Onion article, the failure to get into private college to be the most financially responsible act of a 17-year-old's life. Like most Onion articles, there's a kernel of truth to that or more than a kernel, that the typical, once you control for where people kind of get in, so once you control for test scores and GPA, going to the public college is always better. It's like always better. That you have the same outcomes as a similarly ranked private school, but at way less of a cost. But one of the questions here that me and a couple co-authors had wanted to answer was, well, let's say that you start out in a college. You get a negative signal about, your fit or whatever at the college. In particular, you're on academic probation. So we have data for every public school from the state of Ohio, every student at every public school. And then we can follow these students. Everything is anonymized. But these are linked with essentially tax records. And so we can follow these students for years and years after school. And one thing we can do is we can have this, the experiment that we are effectively doing here. And statistically, it's a lot more complicated than this, but this is fundamentally what we're doing. So think about comparing someone with, say you're already on probation. You have someone who gets a 1.99 GPA, falls just below the threshold to stay in, they get kicked out of school. Then you have someone with a 2.01 GPA. They just barely get to stay in school. We're going to follow those people over time, and there's many of them. So we're not just talking about following two people, many different people, and see, well, what are the outcomes for people who just barely get kicked out and barely stay in? The reason this is a good kind of what economists sometimes call a natural experiment is because the worst thing that we could do is compare someone, like we don't want to compare people who have a 2.0 GPA with people with a 4.0 GPA. Because the 4.0, there's all sorts of stuff that is different about the people with a 4.0 versus a 2.0. But a 1.99 versus a 2.01, those are fundamentally the same people. In other words, we've controlled for the ability thing that I was, the ability bias that I was talking about before. These are the same people, yet just because of this kind of arbitrary rule, some get kicked out of school and some don't. And so when we follow them, we find big returns for the people who just barely get to stay in school. This implies that, now the returns are concentrated among the people who eventually got the degree. So people who eventually dropped out or failed out later did not get the big returns. So we're talking about, you have to get the degree. But the point is that for those who got the degree, even though they had gotten this early negative signal, they wound up getting huge returns to their college diploma. So by age 30, they had already recouped all of the implicit, so the opportunity costs of not being in the labor force, and the explicit, so tuition, books, that kind of stuff. By age 30, they'd already recouped all of that they'd paid. And so every extra dollar that they earned past that, is icing on the cake, and they, made, quite a bit more. So this is just a kind of a descriptive graph to show what I'm talking about here. The people who eventually got the degree, you can see the seasonality of, because people do work, as I'm sure many of you are. I worked when I was in school. You can see that this is clearly the summer quarter right here. So the people, who eventually got the diploma, they're earning less. This is the implicit opportunity cost. Then they start to graduate. And pretty quickly, you see, the overtaking point, and then, this, gap just grows and grows later. All right, how am I doing on time? All right, so I'll just talk a little bit about, state divestment. If we're, states have significantly pulled back from, public higher education in recent years. Since 1987, the average per student subsidy has dropped by about $2,400 per full-time equivalent person per year. So, it's almost 25%. And that has to be made up somewhere. This is one of the big reasons that you've seen, the tuition at public schools rise as quickly as it has. There are many other reasons too that I won't have time to get into, but we can talk about later. But this is as a big component of it. Now, one thing to recognize. So this is, one, you can clearly see the effect of recessions. That following recessions is a big time when the state divests. One of the big reasons, though, one of the big ways that divestment has happened has not been. So this yellow line is the absolute level of spending, and you can see that over time spending has actually increased a little bit on overall higher education spending. The problem is that the number of people in higher education has increased dramatically more. So this is why the per student figure has dropped so much, because there are now so many more people in college, but many states are funding, so take Temple for instance. Temple has, I believe Temple has doubled in size since the year 2000, but the state appropriation has stayed exactly the same. So in effect, it has, it has dropped by half because, they're on a per student basis, they're getting half as much as they were before, and that's what really matters when it comes to spending. That you need, if you have more students, then you're going to have more professors, more everything, and so if you're not getting any more money, then you have less in effect. How does this affect tuition and spending? So I found that in recent years that about a third of, if states, drop $1,000 per student in support, about a third of that goes to increase tuition, and about 2/3 of it goes to reduce spending. Now, people look at that and they say, oh, well, It's not that bad of a deal. I mean, tuition went up some, but spending went down a lot. One of the problems is that spending it is significantly associated with good outcomes for students. That a really nice new paper by Deming and Walters found that spending decreases, which are caused by this state divestment, dramatically lowered graduation rates, which ties back to everything I said before. That if graduation is one of the big drivers of what makes college a worthwhile investment, and then cutting spending hurts your likelihood of graduation, there's actually this paper actually finds that, like, from a student perspective, it would actually have been better for there to be for schools to have passed all of it to students in the form of higher tuition, rather than cutting spending. So the point is this, just because you're not seeing it in tuition, if you're seeing it in other things that hurt your likelihood of graduation, that hurts as well. So another question, well, where's it going? Where, if you look over time, there's two big spending categories that have gone up considerably. K12 spending, and this is a general category called public welfare. This is health spending. There's a lot of overlap between these, and the definitions get rather hairy. So what I'll tell you in general is that disproportionately, where everything went has been to Medicaid. So Medicaid spending is the single biggest driver of the reduction in spending on higher education. Now, this makes things really difficult because if you sometimes listen to you read an article in the popular press, and you'll hear some a higher ed advocate talking about the funding for the prison system, and saying, oh, this money is going, and it's true, that's a politically unsavory thing. The problem is that's not where the money is going. The money from higher education is disproportionately going to Medicaid. And that's problematic because this is the type of people who generally like more spending on higher education are also the same people who generally like more spending on Medicaid. So my point is that there's not an easy fix here. That there's not a boogeyman that you can just say, all right, we're going to eliminate this state line item, and then suddenly everything's better for higher ed. And this is only going to get this pressure is only going to get worse in future years because of the trajectory of healthcare costs. Both in terms of just mechanically, even if nothing changes in healthcare, that the federal government has been paying for a big part of Medicaid expansions over the past few years, and that federal match is declining right now. So just mechanically, even if we solve the cost problem in healthcare today, there's still going to be more pressure on higher ed, but we definitely have not solved it. So the point is that all these things are related. That everything here, when we're talking about the fiscal situation with respect to healthcare, it relates intimately to funding for higher ed. And I'll just conclude here. So this is my last slide, and I hope I've left enough time for questions. So some kind of future directions, and these are just things that are being proposed and talked about. And I'm happy to talk about whatever you guys have questions on. I mean, I've been really involved in the push for reforming the accountability system, trying to get some of the worst actors out in some of the truly predatory schools that are delivering a very bad product, but also taking a lot of money from people in the process. There are things being talked about in terms of funding options for students. There's what are called income share agreements. There's a lot of ways that these can be set up, either through private donors or through charitable organizations. This is essentially promising people a percentage of your future income in exchange for getting college today paid for. Some people are really, really excited about these. Others really, really hate them. I'm somewhat in the middle in that I think that they're not this evil thing. But it also isn't going to revolutionize the system. I think it would plug a very small hole in the current market failure that is our student loan system. But it's not going to drastically change things. There's others too, but I want to give you guys time for some questions, or if you guys don't care about this and want to leave early, feel free to. But anyway, yeah. So thank you so much for having me. I hope this was somewhat interesting for people.
So, did you? Now I don't know if this is part of any of your study, but have you seen in anything about the vocational schools or maybe trade schools, and did they maybe fit in between high school and college, or where were they?
Yep. No, great question. So the question is about kind of where do trade schools, vocational schools fit in terms of the returns to college. So they right now are pretty much all lumped into to this somewhere between a 4-year degree and but more than a high school diploma. There's huge heterogeneity in these. That on average, you're still saying a 4-year degree is still on average better than the typical trade or vocation. But there are some trades and vocations that are really, really lucrative and would be would be up here. This is just kind of an average of them all. I will say this is a really, really interesting and important question, and is on my my list of things to dig into in a much more detailed way in the future.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of these schools that target students? And as someone with younger siblings, looking to go to college, how can we spot them?
So if you're watching TV at night and there's an infomercial that comes on, that's one of them. I'm being slightly glib. So on average, for-profit schools deliver a much worse quality of education, have much lower outcomes. I will give an example of a for-profit chain that has since gone under, so I'm not at risk of offending anybody. There's a for-profit chain called Corinthian College that they went out of business because they partnered with a temporary employment agency. And among other things, they partnered with a temporary employment agency, and they said, we'll pay you some amount of money if you hire every one of our graduates for 2 weeks after they graduate. That way, they could say they have 100% job placement rate. Now that's fraud. That's literal fraud. And the problem is in many cases, people are operating in much more of a gray area, where you're overpromising things. You're putting the one person on the commercial who actually did really well, but on average, they don't have good outcomes. This is why go to things like the college scorecard. So this is it's required that schools report certain information in order to participate in the student loan program. And the college scorecard, it has things like the graduation rate, even more importantly, things like the student loan repayment rate. So if you have if you're at a school that has a really low repayment rate, 30% or below, I'm really worried about, things are kind of stacked against you there. Does that hopefully help?
Thank you.
Of course.
What are some approaches and methods that you see other universities taking that are lessening the cost of their tuition? Like, for instance, Purdue has the backboard.
Yep.
Which is very ISA.
Yep.
Are there anything like that other universities are doing, anything other universities should adopt?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, Purdue's backup boiler is a really interesting setup that I cannot wait until there's, enough data to really be able to study it rigorously. Because like I said, with ISAs, and I want to make clear, one of the reasons that I'm not super bullish on ISAs is because I think they're essentially an insurance contract. So in order to correctly price insurance, you need a lot of data. You need a lot of very, very accurate data, not just on the average return, but on the entire distribution of returns. And that data, for the most part, just doesn't exist right now. So the reason that I'm somewhat less optimistic about most ISA programs is because I don't think that they're going to be able to price them right in order to be, competitive and also, good for students. Purdue's is different because Purdue's is not trying to make a profit. So Purdue's is funded essentially charitably, and they're just trying to break even, or they're okay if they come in a little bit under. This is potentially a much better way of if you don't have to make a profit, it's much more likely you're going to be able to offer terms that are good enough for students. Now, to get back to your main question, which is what are some other things that schools are doing? I'll mention one that Temple's doing. So there's what's called Fly in 4, which is essentially kind of like a contract where trying to keep students, one, on track to graduate, and two, on track to graduate on time. This involves things like regularly meeting with advisors, hitting certain checkpoints, taking a certain number of credit hours each semester. And one of the things that Temple promises is if you don't graduate, like if it's been 4 years, and you have because you changed majors or something happened that it's going to take you more time to graduate. They won't pay it. Then you get free tuition after that point. So basically, you're only paying for 4 years. That if you fulfill your end of the bargain, you're only going to pay for 4 years of tuition, and you're not going to pay for anything extra. I think that has, again, it's still too early to really see the returns to that. I think that at least has some promise of keeping student debt from really ballooning, because one of the big issues that students face is that the financial aid packages. There's, as I'm sure everyone here knows, there's tons of fine print in them, and often that fine print includes, this offer is only good for 4 years. So you got financial aid, and so maybe you're rather than paying the full tuition of $20,000 a year, you're only paying $6,000 a year for each of your first 4 years, and that's what you expect to be paying. And then you change majors, and now it's going to take you 5 or 5.5 years to graduate. That 5th year, you're likely not getting that financial aid anymore. And what was $6,000 that you're paying now is a $20,000 bill. That is really shocking to people, and that weren't expecting it. And it does. There's evidence that it does not just greatly increase student debt, but it causes a lot of people to just say, geez, maybe this isn't worth it. There's evidence that if people have kind of a negative financial shock at the same time that they get this, effectively reduction in financial aid, a lot of people just drop out of school, even if they're relatively close to graduating.
It seems like that Lions 4 doesn't give much incentive to finish in 4 years. You might just well hang out for another year or two and live the good life.
Well, you have to hit the if you are living the good life, you likely are not fulfilling your end of the contract. So you have to take a certain number of credit hours. You have to be meeting these targets. So I'm sure there is, as always the case, people can. There's probably a way to game any system, but you'd have to try really hard to game this one.
Thank
Income
you.
to measure knowledge acquired from the university.
Yeah. So this is. So the question is, can you use income to measure knowledge? And frankly, I don't think so. Like, income measures something. It's a good measure of what the labor market, how the labor market values a particular set of skills. And so if you're talking about knowledge times the labor value of that specific type of knowledge, I'm more comfortable with that. But if you're saying like just straight up knowledge, I mean, philosophy is a really, really, really difficult degree to get. The labor market return isn't very difficult. There are plenty of majors that earn a lot more than philosophy that are a lot easier, and arguably, you have less quote unquote knowledge. Maybe it's more useful in a labor market sense knowledge, but when you're talking about such drastically different majors, it's really difficult to measure knowledge, especially again at the college level. I think we're better at doing it, not good, but better at doing it at the K12 level. But yeah.
What did you say your email address is?
Douglas.weber@temple.edu.
And your website?
Doug-Weber.com. If you Google Doug Weber Economics, that'll get you there. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really have enjoyed my time here, and I hope you guys did too.